This episode of the Golf Guru Show is sponsored by enveedhemp.com. That's ENVEED hemp.com. I'm happy to say that Enveed has been my choice for my CBD needs for almost 3 years now, and I can't begin to tell you how it's improved my life. They come in 3 formulas: Clarity, Relief, and Relax. I typically take a Clarity drop in the morning with my coffee to get me focused and ready to go for the day. Some relief for my aches and pains or inflammation after a run or a workout. And then I do a drop of Relax before I go to bed that helps me get some of the best sleep that I've had in years. And my Whoop Band now tells me that it's definitely helping because my recovery scores have been higher than ever. Enveed Hemp CBD come in drops, roll-ons, and gummies, so you can take it however you choose. So go to enveedhemp.com and make sure you use the Guru code GURU20 for a 20% discount for life. You heard it right, 20% discount for life. CBD is a great supplement to keep you healthy and safe in these crazy times. So go get it. So let's get to today's episode.
It's not what you know, it's what you can prove.
You know how to cut to the core of me, Baxter. You're so wise. You're like a miniature Buddha covered in hair.
I want to become a guru so girls will like me. Then I will like myself.
Now, before we do this, let's go over the ground rules. Rule number 1, no touching of the hair or face.
Of course.
And that's it! Now let's do this!
What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Golf Guru Show. I am your host, Jason Sutton, and I am the Guru, where it is my mission to interview the top coaches and top instructors in our industry that I've been fortunate enough to build relationships with. And this episode is no different, as I have my good friend TJ Yeaton. TJ is someone I've wanted to have on the show for some time. I've watched this young man grow up and do an amazing job, whether it's teaching tour players or now teaching at the club level and doing a little bit of both. But a little bit about TJ. He is now currently the Director of Instruction at Belle Meade Country Club in Nashville, Tennessee. But more importantly, TJ has been working with players at the highest level on tour since he just came out of college, which is an interesting conversation in itself, how that was created and what he's learned throughout his young career. He's only 33, but I've watched this young man grow up and just know that he's one of the brightest and most talented instructors in our business. And this was just a really cool conversation, and he was very transparent in some of the things that he learned and some of the things that he's doing with his players now, and some great advice for young coaches out there that might think that it's really easy to just jump out and start teaching on tour, which is, we know it's not the case. So I really appreciate TJ bringing his wisdom and his knowledge to the podcast. I would suggest you give him a follow on social at TJ Yeaton Golf on Twitter and on Instagram, and be prepared for a great conversation or debate. But nonetheless, you're going to learn something. So without further ado, let's get to this conversation with my friend TJ Yeaton. Enjoy. All right, TJ, welcome to the show, man. Thanks so much for taking the time. I know I saw you just a few weeks ago, but I appreciate you coming on.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
So we had some really cool discussions at the Top 100 Summit, and we'll possibly go in that direction. We talked a lot about teaching tour players and doing some things and just coaching in general. But I want to start with, not all the way back, but I want to start with your education at Campbell. And I think that's an important part of your journey, an important part of your preparation for kind of where you are right now. And I reached out to our mutual friend, Mr. Orr, this morning. And so I want to start with you telling the story about when you almost left the PGM program.
I bet he couldn't tell that story fast enough. I think that's one of his all-time favorites. I think every class that's been there since I left has heard this story. So after, for those that don't know, Campbell it's changed a lot since I was there, but it was a relatively small Southern Baptist school. And I didn't grow up Southern Baptist. I grew up in New England, and just a totally different culture than what Campbell University was. And it was a little bit of a culture shock my first year there. And the only excitement on campus on the weekends was golf. That was it. Everybody went home. It was a suitcase campus. So after my first year there, I kind of decided I wanted a bigger school experience. So I decided I was going to transfer. I was going to transfer to, I think at the time it was New Mexico State, just a bigger school with a different kind of atmosphere and environment. And I think I was in his class, and I can't remember intro to teaching or player development or something. And I don't know exactly how it came up, but he, the question of who was coming back or what everybody was doing came up. And I think I was the only one dumb enough to raise my hand to the question of like, who's not coming back next year. I think he just flat out asked that question. I think I was dumb enough to raise my hand. And I don't think anything at the immediate time was out of the norm. I think the class went on as normal. And then afterwards, he pulled me aside. I think we were in his car, and he lit into me for about, God knows how long it was. It felt like days. I'm sure it was probably closer to 15 or 20 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. And he just went on and on about, what is it you want to do? What do you want to get out of this business? What do you want to get out of your career? And he already knew at the time I wanted to teach, and that was the road I was going down. And, he told me if that's what I wanted to do, and if that's what I was serious about, that I'd be crazy for leaving Campbell. Right. And, they use the term, I think, like struck the fear of God in you. And, and I never experienced it until that very moment. So, he ended up basically convincing me to stay, and then I went on to be his assistant and his apprentice. And, we've been very close ever since.
Yeah. So go a little bit deeper into that. So I think, because I've had Campbell, students as my assistants, and I think you guys are some of the most educated, especially on the teaching side, that I've met. And I always say you're kind of an anomaly because you came out of college. For those that don't know, I mean, I can't believe you're 33, or is that right?
Yeah, 33.
Yeah, I mean, you seem like you've been in the business for like 20 years.
Feels like it.
Which you probably have, right? So
it feels like
you started teaching when you were 12.
Yeah, exactly.
But not too many young coaches come out of PGM and then immediately start working with tour players. And I always found that fascinating. So I've got a lot of questions about that. But what do you think prepared you for that environment that quick, that early in your career? And obviously it had a lot to do with Mr. Orr and then some of your other influence. But how would you answer that?
Yeah, the first lesson I ever shadowed, I'd taken a few lessons when I was in high school, but really the first lesson I ever shadowed was with David teaching a tour player. And that was all really I knew, right? My whole introduction to teaching was almost completely backwards, right? So, my first foray into, shadowing a lesson and being around golfers and education, the education of golfers was developmental tour players and Corn Ferry tour players. Back then it would have been a nationwide tour. We had PGA tour players coming through campus. And, I'd probably sat through more lessons with tour players my first couple of years at Campbell than I had, your average club player. And that was kind of the environment that I was thrust in. And I got a firsthand experience of what it was like to, be around those players, talk to those players. That type of player sometimes deals within, a higher level of information and delivery, and, they have totally different experiences when it comes to golf. So, by the time I was 19, 20 years old, I'd seen and been part of and participated in far more lessons with high level players than I had, the recreational player. And I was fortunate that, my connection, being around David, obviously is a world-renowned instructor, has an incredible network. Basically we're the early adopters of technology, right? So this is kind of in the era where TrackMan and 3D was becoming more affordable, and Coaches, manufacturers weren't the only ones that had these, the TrackMan systems or flight scope systems. And so, being around David and David's network, I got to be around basically everybody that was coaching on tour at the time, right? It was an incredible network and incredible people to be around, and they were all early adopters of this technology. So I got in, and started understanding how to teach and coach with technology and what technology was assessing and how to use it. So by the time I was 20 or 21, I had an unbelievable background in teaching, which is, I think, both good and bad. It's good now, but it was bad at the time for a 21-year-old.
You're giving all these young coaches like false hope.
I know.
coming out of college, which I think is it's good and it's bad, but hey, it's like, kudos to you being that young and being on the road. Did you get to go with David to the tournaments? Were you kind of assisting him there, or was it just in Bowie's Creek?
It was mostly in Bowie's Creek. I think we went to Wells Fargo, which in Charlotte was driving distance away. I think back then at that particular event, we were doing a lot of testing with Adele, and we were doing a lot of Adele fittings, and David was there fitting some players for Adele's. But most of the time there were always players coming through Bowie's Creek, and obviously I was still a full-time student, so I was attending classes and had a full schedule, and didn't have the freedom, to just up and leave and go to different events. But I went to, I think, 1 or 2 events with David when I was a student there. So
let's talk about your preparation, because I know when I first met you, you were spending a lot of time with Mac. I know you had a lot, a golfing machine background, through David. And I guess most people didn't realize David was teaching full swing at the time, right? He wasn't always a putting coach. And I first met him, he was teaching full swing, and he got involved with Mike and Andy at some point. Like, there was a whole lineage, I think, of just education that you got. So talk about, how did you feel like, and give us sort of the blueprint of how you went through it. It almost sounds like, this is horrible interviewing right here, because I'm not answering the question, but it almost sounds like you were learning on the job as you were like teaching tour players a bit.
Kind of. So I would say to that point, I was developing as a coach, as a teacher, right? Because I didn't have a lot of experience teaching a lot of golf lessons when I started coaching on tour, or I started coaching tour players. So, the background for me, and again, right, like I kind of did this completely ass backwards, right? You couldn't do this, more in opposite fashion. But I did. So I knew, I knew getting into it that I wanted to teach and I wanted to coach, and that was the avenue I wanted to pursue. And, David introduced me to the golf machine, like you mentioned. And, at the time, this would have been kind of around 2006, 7, 8, where stack and tilt was, become like the thing, right? Like it was exploding. Mike and Andy were coaching everybody on tour. They were having a lot of success. I didn't realize it at the time, but, David and Andy and Mike were all really, really close, and they all had the Mac connection. And, so David introduced me to the golf machine, and I did, the golf machine education. And, obviously David was a tremendous full swing instructor and knew the golf machine really well. And David had worked with Mac. And the first time I'd ever heard of Mac was through David. In fact, I think it was the end of my freshman year, where he made mention, like, now that you understand the golf machine, we'll get into the Mac stuff next year. Right. And I'm like, wait a minute, like, what is Mac stuff? Who the hell is that? Yeah. And so through David, I ended up, and again, his network, right? I kind of leached off of his network, met a lot of people, got invited to work with Mac. And, I remember I had college roommates, 4 or 5 college roommates, and, every spring break or fall break, they were going somewhere and doing a cruise or vacation, or, going somewhere and having a good time. And I would literally spend spring break or fall break going and working with Mac O'Grady. So I was very fortunate. I got to work with Mac for, 4 or 5 years. And again, right, just that network of people that were involved in the golf machine and were, involved with Mac O'Grady, it was kind of basically the Golf Magazine top 100 list currently, right? There was all those.
It's a huge tree. It seems like everybody had a connection.
Yeah.
At some point.
Yep. And, they were all early adopters of technology. And, so I got to be around some unbelievably smart people, when I was really, really young. Right. And I don't think I'd still given a golf lesson on my own yet at this point. Right. So my first year out of Campbell, I was teaching in Florida at an academy when a friend of mine who now coaches on tour, who at the time was playing, Drew Steckel, had a roommate that he was living with in Orlando who had gotten back into playing the game, had taken some time off and was teaching and decided he's going to get back in the game, and asked Drew to coach him. And Drew said, well, I'm not a teacher. I'm still trying to play, but, I know TJ, and TJ's been helping me out, and, why don't TJ and I help you? And so I was 22 years old. I think this would have been around 2010, 2011.
And who was this?
This is Elliot Gailey.
Yeah, I remember that guy. I met that guy a long time ago.
Yeah. So, and Elliot, it was actually pretty easy for Elliot because Elliot had worked with David. So it all comes back full circle, right?
Yeah. I understand.
So I think, the fact that I had a relationship with David and Drew, and, it kind of gave me some legitimacy as a golf instructor. And Elliot, said, sure, came and worked with us. And I traveled with Elliot, and, we went to, 6 or 7 events that year. And I think that would have been 22 years old. So I'd probably taught more hours to tour players at 22 years old than I'd probably given
That's
just
insane.
normal golf lessons at a club. Yeah.
So what did that look like? I mean, how did you know how to handle a player? I mean, like, just the structure. I mean, yeah, it's like,
I did.
Talk a little bit about, because I know you've come a long way now, and it's like you've taught so many tour players, and it's probably just, another day at the office now when you go on the road with them. But what did it look like back in those days?
It was messy. It was, I didn't, 22 years old, you're not exactly understanding the business of, coaching on tour, really even the business of golf for that matter, right? Like I didn't know anything back then. So like the challenging part of coaching on tour is not only the teaching aspect, but the business aspect and the scheduling aspects and the expectation, right? Like all the things that I think go into being a coach. Because I think at that time, I thought it was as easy as just teach the X's and O's better than anybody else and just make the swing as good as it can be. And that was all it took. Mm-hmm. So working with Elliot that first year was a huge learning curve, in time management and scheduling and kind of creating and setting expectations between the player and coach and trying to figure out, responsibilities and, working within a team, because when you work with tour players, you're not just coaching the player, but you have to work with, potentially a caddy and a manager, sports psych, maybe, if you're full swing coach, you might have to work with a putting coach, short game coach. I've worked with players that didn't speak English and I had to work with translators. Wow. So that first year with Elliot, I think the only thing that went well were the X's and O's, right? I think that part was actually okay. The rest of it was kind of a nightmare. That was a huge learning curve for me, but it was kind of a crash course into, that world.
Well, that's what I was kind of talking about. You're sort of learning on the job. It wasn't probably as much the information. It was more like the coaching piece, right? And the organization, the structure.
Yeah, the business.
Like how to, I haven't been out there on the road. I would be kind of the same way. Like, okay, let's put this on paper, or what are we going to do?
Yeah.
How are you going to guide that through, how to get that player through that week, and what's that going to look like?
Yeah. And I think if you've never worked with tour players, right? Like there's a lot of vaguities and ambiguity when it comes to like who's going to be where at what time. Right? Like there's tour player time where if they say they're going to be there at 9 a.m., it's probably closer to like 11 a.m. Right? And so like there's just a lot that went into it. And, I remember like it was probably 3 or 4 events into this, and Elliot looked at me and goes, well, what do I owe you? And I didn't know. I didn't have an answer. Like the thought had never even occurred to me that
like teach it for free.
Exactly. Right. Like I just, I didn't even know what to say. Right. As crazy as that sounds. So I think the only thing that went well was teaching the golf swing for Elliot. But I appreciate him putting, his trust in me, and I certainly learned a lot from him, especially as a coach and from playing. And fortunately, Elliot, he played okay that year. He played really well, and Had some good finishes where he hadn't historically played very well on tour, and that snowballed for me into working with more players, and it's now been my 11th year coaching on a professional tour, like a major professional tour.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, it's how was it as far as like your age? Like, it had to be difficult. You had to be some challenges as far as, I mean, you're looking around and you probably at that point, probably had Jim McLean on one side and you got, Foley on the other side, and you got, guys are Scott Hamilton, and you're like, who's this guy? Right.
Yeah. Well, it's been so long. Yeah. I don't know.
It's 11 years, bro. It's not that long.
Well, so it's let's put it this way. It's been long enough that I remember when Scott Hamilton was still traveling with Stephen Bowditch on the nationwide tour, and he had his little tripod, and he was there every single week, and he was the only instructor out there that had his little tripod. That's how long it's been. I don't think I've seen Scott at a Corn Ferry Tour event in a long time, but it was and of course those were the people that I looked up to, right? Those are the people I wanted to be. I wanted to be the Sean Foleys, and I wanted to be the Ledbetters and the Harmons and McLeans, and it was honestly I was out of my league. I was overwhelmed, right? And believe it or not, the reason I actually grew facial hair was to make myself look older. And my wife said you look good with it, so it just stuck.
We're all trying to look younger. You're trying to look older.
Yeah, I was trying to look older. That's literally the reason I started growing facial hair, probably 6 or 7 years ago.
Do you think that, because I know you really well and you'll take this the right way, but I always say you're kind of like an old grumpy man, like in a young man's body. And I even talked about that to David. I said, how long has he been that sort of edgy, sort of, dry sense of humor, sarcastic kid? And he goes, the whole time I've known him.
Forever, right?
But it probably had to be, right? Like you had to have some defense mechanism to like deflect probably a lot of stuff that you were dealing with being in that big arena, would you say?
Yeah, and I grew up, in New England, where as I moved out of New England, I realized like people are a lot nicer, so you just the culture I grew up in, there's like a lot of ribbing and there's a lot of sarcasm, and even part of my interest in teaching was, I kind of always had this like cynicism about the world, right? Like, I kind of approach this like you're full of shit, and until you prove yourself correct, like I'm going to think you're full of shit, right? Like I'm not just going to take what you say at face value. And I think that's what I love so much about teaching was, it was this huge puzzle, right? And people had very strong opinions, and I think my wife says like my cynicism and sarcasm has certainly gotten worse over the years, which I'm sure it does for everybody. But that was kind of how I approached golf instruction, right? Like I read these books by all these great instructors, and my first thought was, I don't know. Like, I don't know if, this is right or not, right? Like, let me dig into this. Let me figure out if it's good or not. So I think it's actually, that skepticism, that cynicism, we call it cynicism.
Yeah. I think it's either one.
Yeah. Right. But I think probably both, but cynicism, maybe a little bit more.
Yes.
But like, that's kind of what led me down this search for understanding and truth, and trying to figure out, like, how does this work, and how can we help people get better, and why does X, Y, and Z, which I think maybe not agree with, but why is this helping this person and not this person? And so that's kind of what drove the desire for learning, right? The desire to understand and try to figure it out, right? It was just this approach, like, I don't think, what you're saying is right. And until it's proven otherwise, like that's just the approach I'll take.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I mean, I'm saying that in a loving way, because
no, totally.
I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of your work, and I've watched you, grow up, and it's been so cool. But that's what makes you great. Is like you're curious, you're a critical thinker, you're a problem solver, and then now, the more time I spend with you, you actually are developing some empathy,
some tact, maybe just
a little
tact.
bit.
I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. A little bit of tact. So,
yeah, I mean, I will say, like, you have to have a little bit of an edge, a little bit of chip when you're 21, 22 years old, dealing with some of the best players in the world. Like you have to have some bravado, and you have to, there's a part that you have to be confident in what it is that you do, and that was part of what I learned being out there.
Yeah, they walk all over you. Like I figured that out a long time ago, even the ones that I've worked with. So let's dig back into just the time that you spent with Mac, and then what you learned, and then Mike and Andy, let's get into a little bit more details of, I guess, a better question. Like, what are some of the things that you're teaching now that maybe you took from Mac? And then you got to give us a Mac story. I mean, since you're kicked out already, there's got to be something. Everybody that spends time with Mac has to tell some stories when they come on the show.
Yeah, the problem with the Mac stories are there's so many. Like, you almost panic trying to decide on which one it's going to be, right? Let me think about that one for a second.
Yeah. Well, just talk about what you learned. Like, what was eye opening? What do you think you carried with you that maybe you still use today?
Yeah, so Mac, what I learned from Mac was like practical application of understanding various patterns, right? And I think the knock that he gets is if you've only spent a little time with him, you only are really kind of exposed to one pattern, right? Like, and that pattern has changed over the years. Mm-hmm. But the longer you hang out with him or the longer you're around him, the more you learn from him, the more you realize, he'll give you, or he'll kind of talk about different patterns. And you never really know what you're going to get, when you work with him. And I was fortunate to be around him long enough that, you kind of got to see a lot of different sides of what he taught or coached. And, so what I learned from him the most was he was on the forefront of like measuring in 3D. He did a lot of stuff with UCLA back in the 80s and was big into golf research, very early on. And he was the first person that talked to me about, understanding the difference in like posture, for example, right? How he was just more descriptive of 3D of how the body moved than golf was traditionally labeling something like posture or, backswing or whatever, right? Matt was talking about forward bend, backwards bend, side bend, your rotation, right? And he was talking about it from this three-dimensional standpoint, whereas at the time, like most of us were using cameras and we're describing things in a very constrained two-dimensional view, right? And Mac was really the first person that started talking about the 6 degrees of freedom in the wrist. And he talked about, how various grip types had different wrist alignments. And all I ever heard was have a good grip and good posture. And again, right, coming from this very skeptical world of cynicism, like, what did that mean? Right? I didn't understand, because you see all these different grips and you see all these different postures. And so nobody ever really defined that for me. And then Mac was the first person, and David too, right? And I should say Mac was the first, but Mac was really the one that kind of dove deep into and went down the rabbit holes and started talking about the minutia really of the golf swing. And, his whole big thing was understanding different patterns, right? And again, he talks mostly about one single pattern, but he was the first person that
CP or the CF.
Yes. So he, my time with him, it was mostly in CP because in my opinion, he hit a hook when he played and, I don't think he had understanding that we do now of why the ball did what it did. And I think if you're a really good player in that era and you hooked it, the solution was to fade it. Right. So I think he got really hung up on, hitting a low cut because when he played, he overdrew the ball, which is really interesting because when he played really well, he swung it very differently than what he does now. Right. So that's just my opinion. I could be wrong. There's probably people that know better than I do, but he was just the first person that spoke in three-dimensional terms and not just kind of traditional golf jargon. And that's kind of what, the level of interest with Matt grew. And then again, from there, right, he always talked about measuring, right? So his big thing was measuring what people did. And of course, like, why wouldn't we do that? Right. If, everybody's sitting there just kind of looking at it and talking about these very abstract things like speed, tempo, rhythm. Right. Like, but nobody had a way to measure or define that. Right.
Yeah. Right.
So again, right. Like coming from this world of questioning and trying to understand and thinking pretty much everybody's full of shit. Like, here's the one guy actually talking about, like, here's how we do it and here's how we measure it and here's how you look at it. And, yeah, sure. He did it with some paper and some protractors for the most part, but like, at least it was better than what else was out there. Right.
Yeah, I mean, he was the first guy to kind of classify swings, right, as far as the positions, right? Was he sort of the godfather of that, and then handed that over to Mike and Andy a little bit, and where they started looking at P1 through P10 and what are all the players doing in those positions? Is that Is that fair? Is that kind of what you guys got from the? I've seen a couple of the papers. I've seen several of the papers, and it's pretty detailed, right? I mean, it's like amazing. And then did you guys? Because I know Doc, our boy Doc.
Yeah.
John Doherty was always trying to like perfect that pattern. Like he wanted to like beat it.
Yeah.
I think you were more like you wanted to teach it.
Yeah. So Doc was always the more sinister when it came to, trying to not get yelled at by Mac, right? Like Doc would always find ways to circumvent how to, avoid being yelled at by Mac. But yeah, so Mac's big thing, like in every notebook I've ever had a Mac, right? And in big letters, usually on the first few pages is taxonomy, right? Like the science of classifying things. And I think Mike and Andy, right? Because then again, this would have been right in that era when they were having so much success coaching on tour, and Stag and Tail was, the thing, right? They kind of gravitated towards like this one pattern. No, it's not really fair, but like this one mostly draw pattern is what was discussed, right? But sure. And Andy can teach every pattern, right? He's an awesome teacher. But they were mostly talking about, hitting one style of ball flight for the most part. But Mac was the first one that started looking at it and saying, like, here are fade pieces, here are draw pieces, here are high pieces, here are low pieces. And here's how to connect the dots, right? And from, being 21 years old, 22 years old, and being exposed to that, right? Like, it was such a huge head start, and it was tremendous. And, so much of it being rooted in the golfing machine. And, then we started getting into tech, and we could kind of expand on, some of the stuff that I learned from Mac. And then we had real 3D measuring tools, and we had better ways to describe and assess ball flight. And it just only kind of fueled that fire towards, kind of where I am now, where we get to today. Would
you say that that's when you first started hearing anatomically correct terms, like flexion, extension? Like you said, side bend, forward bend, all that stuff that's probably gone way back to those times, right? I mean, it's not that long ago, but I mean, it's still long enough to where we've all kind of evolved into understanding those things a little bit more clearer.
Yeah, it's common now, right?
Right.
I think golf instructors and students alike are more comfortable using that terminology in a lesson, and I think that's going to become, common golf jargon. At least I hope so.
Man, that's one of my questions I ask a lot of times. Is like, how important are those terms to you? And it's funny, I did a presentation yesterday at a teaching summit, and one of the questions from the audience was about, flexion, extension. When do you use that? I said, well, I use it daily.
Yeah.
For sure. I think it's useful when we're talking to other teachers, because, everybody understands. If I'm talking to you on the phone, we're not looking at each other. I say at P2, the lead wrist is flexed, then you're immediately going to know what that is. You know what I mean? Like I think it's useful, but I think educating our students also, I think it's important that it's not that difficult, especially if you got a doctor in front of you, obviously, but you got to kind of know the player in front of you. But I mean, how much of that are you using with your players? Obviously a lot probably with your tour players, but even average golfers, would you say?
Every lesson. In fact, I'm of the opinion that as long as you define it and create a common understanding with whomever's in front of you, it's no problem at all. And students can handle that, right? Yeah, I actually think when you're using common golf terms, you leave the door open to more ambiguity. So if you tell, if I ask 10 students to hinge the golf club, I'm going to see just wild variations across the board. I'm going to see side to side movements in the hands. I'm going to see some up and down. I'm going to see some rotation, right? Like that term hinging, it has no meaning, right? So, I think to define terminology, and as long as again, whoever's in front of you understands, it's a non-issue, right? If you just take the time to explain, here's what it is, it's fine. But again, I think golf terms in general are just confusing to players, right? If you say closed face and that's to the left, and you say closed stance and that's to the right, they don't know what that means, right? There's more confusion, I think, if you use those terms than just describe it how it is.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, I don't know. I think it's just your communication has to be clear enough, and you're describing, you're showing them video, you're showing them what you're doing, demonstrating It's not that difficult, but like I said, I think it's the old terminology, and I call it some of the old fluff that we read in some of the early books, and some of the things that can really confuse people, like swing plane, like what does that really, you can draw some lines on a screen, but ultimately you better help them understand what it feels like to put the club in a position and swing it. It's
Right.
like there's so much to that. I mean, looking back, let's kind of circle back a little bit. This is a good question for you, being the younger. You're not as young now, but like you're still young. If you look back to your education at Campbell, say you were David Orr and you were running that PGM program, what would the curriculum look like, and then what would your reading list be?
Oh man,
like what do young coaches need to know nowadays, I guess, is just kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah. So, and I think this probably too has changed for me over the years. All right. So if let's start with curriculum. If we're going to start with curriculum, then, ball flight would be 101 or maybe even 100. I don't know. Right. It's got to be the first thing to understand. Right. Because if you're going to build a philosophy, if you're going to build a curriculum around helping golfers play better, you got to understand that. Right. And I was kind of like that first wave of golf instructors that was at that age going through the education that was privy to that, and we were caught up in like old ball flight laws and TrackMan, right?
Right.
So I think that's got to be 100. I think, you've got to start to understand 3D. You got to understand how the body moves, right? So kinesiology, just basic kinesiology, introduction to biomechanics. I think if you want to be good at what you do, I think that you got to know what the body does. You got to know how it works. You got to know, things like range of motion and joint function, and you have to know what the body does. I think where I would definitely add now at this point is skill acquisition and motor learning. Because you can have the playbook, you can have this idea of what it is you want to teach, but getting people to learn is an entirely different animal. So I think that's going to 100% be part of the equation. Some basic understanding of motor learning and skill acquisition. And then what I would do, which I don't think we got enough of, or at least wasn't detailed enough, is the business of golf instruction. How do you make money doing this? Because I think there's a lot of really good instructors out there that don't make enough money. I remember my first year out of college, I think I made $17,000 gross, right? And I was
right there too.
Yeah, I mean, I was
as an assistant.
I was fortunate that didn't become a long-term scenario for me, because I certainly wouldn't be teaching if that were the case. But I think I thought teaching was standing on the lesson tee 10, 12 hours a day, and you just taught a million golf lessons, and that's how you made money. So I think the business of golf instruction, I would certainly put that in my curriculum as well. I might put that as number one, right? How to actually make money doing this, right? I tell kids that always ask me, about becoming a good instructor. I think there's a lot of ways you can define that, but I always tell kids, if you want to be a good instructor and really successful, just be likable. But if you want to be a great instructor, just be likable and help people play better golf.
There you go.
Right. So, I probably, David tried to teach some of this to us, but skills with people skills, emotional intelligence, I would put kind of right up at the top there in my curriculum. You got to understand people. Right. And then pretty much anything on coaching, right? I think any book you can get your hands on coaching, right? And I've read across multiple disciplinaries and multiple fields in different sports. And, I think golf in general is kind of behind in that regard. I think, you look at what Olympic programs are doing and how they're developing golfers internationally. I think we're a little bit behind in that regard.
Yeah, I kind of define those two as the IQ versus the EQ, right? The emotional intelligence, which I think is difficult to define, not to define so much, but to ascertain. Because I always ask the question, like, how do you train that? Is it a trainable skill? I mean, I've read some books, but it's more just experience that you kind of learn along the way of dealing with people and, reading body language. And like, how do you think you developed that at such an early age? I mean, being able to transition from being kind of a tough kid, fighting his way in a big arena to now you're helping, the average golfers as well.
Yeah. So I think, I think one of my assets has always been, I think I've had a high emotional intelligence, right? I think I've always understood people. I feel like, well, my wife might disagree, but I feel like I know how to, at least in golf, how to talk to people and when to push and when not to push and certain things to say and certain things not to say. And, just how to manage people, how to be around people. And I think, I've always been, so like a social introvert, right? Like I can manage people, I can be around people, but at the same time too, like, I don't mind being alone.
We're a lot alike there.
Yeah. So, but I sometimes just really love people. Right. So I think I've always kind of had that innate ability. Right. And I'm not saying I couldn't do it better than anybody else, but I think I could manage and speak to and talk to people across, different disciplines and different backgrounds and different cultures. And, and I think part of that too is just growing up in an area where it was diverse and, you kind of meet all walks of life and come across all different types of people. And, I think that had a big influence on, developing emotional intelligence from a very young age. But I do think it's probably a trainable skill. I think if you find, somebody who's a really good coach and is really good at it, I think you can certainly learn how to develop emotional intelligence.
Do you encourage, kind of piggybacking on that question about how do we help young coaches and what would you tell your 22-year-old self? Obviously you're, like you said, you did it a little bit in a different way. Are you still a fan of shadowing top coaches? I mean, I know the cool thing I remember when we first met and you and Doc always talked about when you go to the PGA show, it's like maximizing your time with people you admire, people you want to learn from, right? It was all about the dinner. So he's like, okay, who are we having dinner with tonight, right?
Yeah, and so, that was, you would plan that out like months in advance, right? Like, who am I having? Yeah. I think there was actually a book I think I read not long ago, right? It was like Never Have Dinner with Yourself or something like that. Or always have dinner. I don't know. You probably know, but
I understand.
So yeah, I mean, and it was funny. I actually heard somebody kind of knock on the PGA show saying it was kind of a frat party and it was just a way for people to hang out and party. And like, absolutely, right? That's the best part of it, but that's the networking aspect and that's the learning aspect, right? Because I think some of the best conversations I've ever had and some of the things I've learned the most are at those dinners, right? In a very informal, unabridged setting, right? Where people have freedom to say whatever, right? And I actually think we used to have conferences like that and it's become more political. So we can't do that anymore. But there used to be a time where like people would get up on stage and just argue with each other, right? And I think that was great.
Yeah, open forum is getting a little bit away from that now, I guess. But
yeah, like the original open forum, right? That was
somebody threw some pictures up the other day of Joe Mayo like talking to Lynn Blake, and it got kind of heated. But yeah, like I mean, Doc, I always stayed with Doc when I went to the show, and we'd have, I mean, probably the best teaching summit in our condo.
Yeah,
till the wee hours of the night. I mean, just every night people were coming over, and it was great. I mean, that's why we go.
Yeah, and I think shadowing and mentorship is still the way to go, right? And actually, somebody asked me about this the other day with regard to social media, right? Because I think we have a generation of golf instructors that are learning via what they see on social media, right? And you can see the same drills, repeated over and over again. You can see the same conversations had over and over and over again. I think what's going to get lost in the social media era is understanding of how to be variable, right? So like, I think we're looking at this and saying, okay, this is what to teach X, Y, and Z, but you don't really know why that instructor decided to go down that route, or if that instructor teaches other patterns, or if they, have the toolbox to go in different directions and try different things with different students. I think there's going to be too much of a playbook from social media, right? And then it's going to become about just making like really pretty golf swings, which is exactly where I started this whole thing, thinking helping people play better golf was just making the perfect golf swing, right? Having the right X's and O's. So I think shadowing is 100% the best thing, right? I mean, you got to go, because you got to get in there and you got to discuss and find understanding and have dissent and have, questions. And you've got to have a really good understanding of, what was that instructor thinking, right? Why would they do this? Why would they say this at this time? Why would they, have the student work on X, Y, and Z, right? I think, and then actually, I have students, or not students, excuse me, but people that come and watch me teach, and then after a lesson they'll ask, well, why'd you do that? Right. And then sometimes, I'll ask them, well, what would you have done? Right. And having that banter and discussion and the back and forth, I think is how we learn and how we grow and how we get better. And I think, if you stop shadowing instructors and you stop, seeking people out and you stop finding mentorship, you're losing out.
Yeah, I agree. I'm glad you said that. I had a kid that shadowed me all day today, and it was great. I mean, he came in. I actually met him a couple of days ago yesterday at the teaching summit. And I said, yeah, come on through. And he hung out and saw me give 6 or 7 different levels of golf lessons. They all kind of looked different, right? Coaching sessions versus some technique stuff, some first time students. And then afterwards we had to talk about it. And then it was great. And this is advice for other young coaches. If they go shadow another coach, he said, he was taking a ton of notes. So I'm like you, I'm curious, like, what was he writing down? Right. I want to learn what I did. And so he goes, is it okay if we follow up in like a week with a phone call? I got questions. I want to sort of think about everything that I saw today. And then I could ask him, like, perfect. I'm happy to do that. So you're sort of, and plus it makes you teach harder, I think, too. And you're trying to help somebody else, and
totally.
And so I think it's cool.
Yeah, and look, if somebody comes and they say, look, I think everything you just did was bullshit, right? It's like my cousin Vinny. I think you don't know what you're doing. Like, I want to understand why they think that, and how can I get better, and what can I learn from how they viewed me, and how do they think that lesson went, right? Because I think every lesson I give is great. Right. But they might have a different opinion, right? They might say, man, that lesson was terrible. But yeah, so I want the dissent. I want discussion, and I want to kind of pry and figure out, how can we make this better? I think if you're a young instructor, it's the best thing you can do is just go watch people teach, literally watch a lesson. And honestly, I watch people teach that I didn't like what they taught, right? Like and I've heard Chris Como talk about this too. And this is just kind of what I did. Even before knowing Chris, which I think was pretty fortunate, right? Is I would just look at books and read books and say, okay, I don't really agree with this, but yet this person is having success. I want to go figure out, why, what are they doing, right? I can't be dismissive of what it is they're doing just because I don't agree with it. What is it about it? Might not be what they teach, but maybe it's just how they teach and how they get people to feel better. And, people are excited to be there and see them, right? There could be a million reasons why people get better.
Yeah, exactly. So how would you, it's kind of a broad question, but how would you describe your teaching philosophy and maybe what you believe in, right? We can go pretty deep into some of the stuff because obviously it's the person in front of you. I know it depends and all that, but if a young coach asks you that question, like, what would you tell them?
Just hit P1 through P10, man. Just get them all. It's a good question. I don't know if I have a great answer for that, right? How do you do it? What's your philosophy? How do you do what you do? I don't know. I've never really tried to put pen to paper to figure that out. I don't know. I try to take this very diverse background and this toolbox of how to get players to play better, right? And try to go through and figure out what tools do I have that can help this player. And I think as going back to shadowing, right, and learning and you're kind of broadening your horizon as an instructor, even outside of golf, and just start looking at other disciplines and business and, other sports or, whatever it is. You start to build this, multifaceted way through which you can help people. Right. And, I guess, what I would say is I just have this very expansive toolbox that I've put together over a very long time. And I'm just going to try to figure out what tools I have that are going to help you, right? In whatever way that may be.
So let's see if we can answer that or ask that a better way. I'm just thinking about things that I've been asked. It's like, how would you describe your style? Right. So we talked about, we can segment that into like motor learning and training, right? So how, like if somebody asked me that, I'd be like, I'm big on slow motion swings. I'm big on a lot of quality rehearsals. I'm big, sometimes static positions. I mean, how would you describe maybe your style and some of the things you like to do to get people to change, get people to change a pattern?
Sure. So, and I would go as far as to say is like, this is where I've probably spent the majority of my time trying to be better, is trying to help players find ways to improve, right? Or get better, right? So the very beginning of like the genesis of teaching for me, it was what to teach, right? Like what do I tell this student in front of them? Like what technical aspects need to change in order for this player to achieve whatever it is they're trying to achieve. Now I would
telling them or just verbal, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Verbal diarrhea, right? Just like do X, Y, and Z, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Now I would say the majority of my lessons are getting students to understand what change is, what it looks like, and what that process entails, how to practice, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're teaching club golfers who, let's be honest, aren't going to practice or certainly not put in the time to practice, like what can you do as a coach to help that player get closer to where it is they need to be, right? Because they're really not going to do much. And they're not going to train in the way a tour player is, who's literally going to do this like rote, repetitive block practice over and over and over again for 60 hours a week until it sticks, right? Because that's just not how they're going to go. So I would say a very small portion of my lessons is, okay, here's what you do. Here's what needs to happen. And the overwhelming majority is, here's how you're going to get there. This is what your practice is going to look like. This is what it's going to entail. You're going to do, 10 balls at 10% effort increasing until you get to 100% on the 10th ball, right? Whatever it may be for that student. Getting people to change, I think, is the real skill in coaching, or at least getting them to look at it differently, right? Because I don't think most golfers know what change is, right? What does it entail? I think, and we've all been guilty of this. We stand there and we think about anything, and we just continuously cycle through this thought until we hit a good shot, and then we correlate that shot to what we were thinking, and then that becomes the solution, right? And we all do it, right? And tour players do it too, and they just happen to be more skilled, and it works more often for them,
right?
But these correlations become so loose that inevitably, right, it's not helping. They're just looking at it differently or putting their attention in a different space, and then they have to start from ground zero again, right? Eventually that thought or that feel wears out and they start all over.
So how do you give them the evidence to know whether they've actually changed or did what you said? What technology are you using? Like video, TrackMan, like what's that look like in your typical session?
Yeah. So I would say in general, feedback, right? I was going to say in general, I think golfers lack feedback, right?
Yeah.
And I would almost, and this is going to go against pretty much everything like motor learning and skill acquisition would say, but we almost become too reliant on intrinsic feedback, right? So like a player hits a good shot, they reflect on what they felt. Okay. And, feelings without an external source of feedback are very subjective, right? Whether or not that's what they did, who knows? Probably not. So, for me, it's getting players to look at this and understanding how to access external feedback, right? So sure, I'll use a launch monitor, I'll take video, I get body track and swing cat and hack motion and flight scope and whatever. Like I've got all that stuff. Really, I only use video and some sort of launch monitor for the most part. Some students, we'll get into it a little bit, but getting students to understand how to access external feedback, because without that external feedback, they really don't know. Right? They believe they're doing it because they're trying to do it. So they think they're doing it. So then they just assume they're doing it. Right? In reality, they're not doing anything even remotely close to what they should be. So I'll tell a lot of students, video, right? I literally
video your own sessions,
just
right?
video, right? Yeah. Here's what you're looking for. Here's how it's supposed to look. Here's how to measure it, right? Here's where the butt of the club should be. Here's where your left arm should be. Here's what your torso should look like. Here's what whatever it is, right?
Right.
And then videotape it. And if it doesn't look the way it should, figure out why. Get in front of a mirror and then start to associate, all right, here's what it should look like, so I'm going to do it, and then build a feel based off of that, right? So I tell students all the time, get in front of a mirror, right? Take a video.
Slow motion, some positions, right? It's like, it's not, that's where I think teaching hasn't change that much. I just think coaches don't take enough advantage of it because they think it's bad.
Yeah.
It's like, how do players understand what impact should look like and feel like if you don't put them in that position? I just don't understand how that's a bad thing.
Yeah. Nor if they have any way to know whether or not they're doing it. Right. Like
exactly.
Even if they can conceptualize, this is where I need to be. And even if they understand why they need to be there, they may think they're there because they're trying to be there, and they're not. And unless they have feedback to let them know, whether it be a training aid or, some sort of training environment or, some sort of augmented feedback like a video or a launch monitor, you don't know.
Yeah. Preach, man. That's good stuff. So thinking back to your career, maybe even the early days, or it doesn't have to be the early days, but was there like a roadblock during your career that you learned from and set you up for later success?
A roadblock.
Something that you would like a failure, that you would like to share.
Yeah. I mean, look, I've coached tour players for 10 years, 11 years now, and I've been fired or quit with just about all of them. Right. So I've, as do most coaches, right, that do that. Right. So I would say in the early days, particularly coaching on tour, let's say, I made a lot of mistakes, right? I don't think there was, I would say one roadblock would be understanding the business side of golf, right? Like how to make money and let's say the business side of coaching on tour, what that looked like, and the coaching side of it, right? Like just being upfront and clear with players on roles and expectations, right? Because, and I think
we talked about a little bit at the show or at the summit, right?
And the reality is it doesn't just apply to tour players, it applies to students at the club as well, right? Like you need to be clear and upfront about, look, if we're to work together, this is what it's going to look like. And this is what I expect from you. And this is what you expect from me. And this is what this relationship should look like. And if there's, any vagueness in what that is, and I think, that relationship can get muddled and it can fall apart pretty quickly. And I think very early on, especially coaching on tour, those roles weren't established early enough. And because of that, even if you were having success with a player, if they didn't like the fact that other players would approach you and ask for help, that could present a problem, right? So if you aren't clear with that player about what does that look like, should that happen, right, then you don't know. So, that would happen all the time. Players would come up and, we would be done practicing or whatever, and they'd ask for help. And then that player wouldn't like that, I help so-and-so, right? And relationships would end because of it, right? So I just think in general, whether it's on tour or at the club, like you need to be upfront about, the coach-student relationship, and just have understanding of what expectations are from one another.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because, following your career, I always kind of knew several of the players you're working with, and you're bringing them up through the ranks, and it seemed like as soon as they would go on the PGA Tour, then they would like change coaches. Thinking, like that always pissed me off. I was just like, well, what the heck? Why would you leave a guy that's helped you? There's no different, right? You just keep going.
Yeah,
and I never understood that. So you think that was more of just them thinking the grass was greener now that they're on the big stage, or was it more like you said, something that you maybe didn't have as far as that relationship goes, and it just breaks down?
Yeah, and I, for a lot of reasons, right? I think what a lot of people don't understand is that on tour, the player-coach relationship dissolves for reasons other than performance. So I think, in the media, when you see so-and-so left coach, it's just assumed, well, it's because that coach doesn't know what they're doing. They're useless. But the reality is players, at that level switch coaches for a multitude of reasons. I had players leave because of the business side of it. They thought they were paying too much money or they couldn't pay or, whatever the case was. I've had players leave because I think they were bored, right? And they just needed something different.
Fresh ideas.
Yeah, which is fine, right? That's okay too. I had one player leave who was playing really well because, talking about mistakes, I was working with one player who was really struggling, and I think I was too dogmatic about what his feel needed to be, right? So we're working on whatever. And I said, I think it needs to feel like this. Well, that feel wasn't his, right?
Mhm.
So like this was a learning curve for me too, right? Like you can't
Yeah.
just tell somebody what to feel. They have to
Right.
come about it on their own, right? They have to develop their own feels. And that's what I learned very early, right? So I had one player was playing really well, and then he fired me after like 3 top 25s in a row and a top 5 because he just didn't like the way it felt, right? Like, what do you do, right? Now, I know, looking back now, I understand, why that happened. You need to let players at that level kind of come about their feels organically, but or intrinsically. But yeah, so it's weird, right? Players leave for different reasons, right? And I think that was always the hard part was, you help players ascend, these various levels of professional golf, and then they get to the ultimate spot, and then they leave, right?
Yeah.
And
I always got pissed because I always saw that happening to you. I'm like, what is going on? Like, what? I just not fair. Do you? Because it's happened to me a couple of times, not to the PGA Tour, but like Corn Ferry or whatever. The relationship gets stale or whatnot, but about half of them will actually come to you and tell you or call you, or maybe it's a text, right? Like, how do you get some feedback from? Like, I usually ask, like, hey, what could I have done differently? How could this have gone better? And I've got some decent answers, but a lot of times it's like, oh, I just need a change. Have you ever done that with a player and got some feedback that's helped you change something?
Yeah, I didn't at first, right? Like the first few years coaching on
Get pissed
tour,
at first, right?
you're pissed, right?
Yeah.
And by the way, like you take it personally. There's no other way
100%.
than to not take. Like I'd have this talk. Sean Foley is. I've talked with this, ad nauseum with Sean, and Sean's like, dude, you can't take it personally. I'm like, dude, I take it personally. Like there's no other way to take it.
It's our livelihood, man. It's like we feel like we've failed them, or we feel like we've done something wrong. I mean, I don't know. I'm the same way.
Yeah, I mean, when you're coaching with at that level in particular, because you spend a lot of time with those players, right? It doesn't mean you can't spend time with club players, but I just don't spend time with club players like I do tour players. So you get to know them, you get to know their families, you know very personal, intimate details about their lives, and they know about yours too, right? Families travel together, and and you work with some players for years, right? So anytime that relationship dissolves, I don't know how one doesn't take it personally. I think anybody that tells you don't take it or they don't take it personally is full of it. Right, I do. So that's a side note. But yeah, my first few years I didn't because I would be too much in a shell, right? First of all, it didn't even occur to me, right? Like I don't even think that thought crossed my mind. I was too pissed. But then, as years went on, you're like, well, why? Like, why does this keep happening? And I've had conversations with players, and again, right? It's for all kinds of reasons. Oftentimes, it's not performance related, but maybe it's just, they didn't like the way you spoke to them, or it's
right.
Yeah, but anyway, like you kind of learn from it, and you go, and some of it is business and some of it is performance, right? Sometimes players just don't play better, right? And fortunately, I don't think that's been the case most of the career. I think most players have gotten better, but it happens, right? Like you try your best, and you help somebody.
Yeah, I was talking to, it wasn't long ago, I was talking to Mark Blackburn about this, and he was saying, I mean, of course, when you got more tour players, you can sort of pick and choose ish, right? But I mean, they almost just pick you. It's like picking a player that you think you're going to be able to help based on your personality and your style. And like, how do you feel about that? Like some coaches and tour players just aren't going to mesh, right?
100%. Yeah,
and
totally.
Probably, I don't know that you can really do that. I mean, I guess if you're out there all the time and guys are coming up to you, you can sort of go, that guy's not going to work, or you can sort of pick and choose. But what kind of player do you think you've worked with and it sort of meshed with the best based on your style?
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I've turned a player away this year, 2-time winner on the PGA Tour, asked for help, and I just knew it would never work with them. Our personalities were too different. I don't think we just wouldn't work well together, right? So, first of all, I do think, and it depends where you're at, right? Like when I was 22 or 23 years old, I wasn't really in the position to tell somebody no.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Like I didn't have any money. Yeah. You take whoever you can get. Right. And fortunately now I think, if you're in a position, like obviously Mark has had tremendous success, and look, Mark doesn't need to coach on tour right? Like if he just wanted to stay home and make a lot of money teaching golf lessons at the club, he could, right? So I think if you're in a stable enough position, like you have the ability to tell players no. And I think one thing that I've learned over the last 10 years is you do have to kind of be picky and choosy about who you want to work with. And because ultimately if you know the relationship is not going to be successful, that player's performance is going to reflect that.
Right.
And there were players
and your
looking back,
reputation's going to take a hit.
big time, right?
Right.
And there were
Yeah.
players looking back, like I know I shouldn't have worked with, right? I knew it wouldn't work, but I don't know if it was, being naive or arrogant or whatever it may be, but I knew the relationship wouldn't work, but I worked with them anyway. And of course, inevitably when it didn't work out, nobody was really surprised, but I think fortunately I'm in a position now where, I don't have to coach 6 guys on tour anymore to eat. Right. And
Yeah.
if you're in the echelons of Mark Blackburn's and Sean Foley's and, you can be picky and choosy. If you're a young coach and, that's what you want to do and that's the avenue you want to pursue, then you do whatever it is, you have to survive. But yeah, I think if you're going to be successful, you do have to be a little choosy about who you work with.
Yeah, for sure. So talk a little bit about where you are right now, because I know you've changed jobs a few times in the last few years, right? And talk about your spot now. It sounds pretty sweet.
Yeah, so we're in Nashville now. We were in Atlantic Beach, Florida the last couple of years, and I spent summer out in Wyoming teaching out in Jackson Hole. We're about to have our second child, and going back and forth from Florida and Wyoming, it wasn't particularly feasible.
Sure.
So we needed to be somewhere where we could be, year round and all be together. So I'm at Bellmead Country Club now in Nashville, Tennessee, and it's an awesome facility. It's a club that's 120 something years old, I think 1901. So it's been around. It's a very established club in the Nashville area, and it's got a tremendous membership, great facilities. Got a nice little teaching academy in the back, which is awesome. Something I've never had, which I've always had ambitions of trying to get something built. And we got just an awesome staff and awesome people. Tennessee's, it's great. We're renting a house in a place that's not great, but the rest of Tennessee is pretty awesome. But yeah, Nashville is a great town, and it's just I think we underestimated a little bit how busy Nashville is. This place has kind of exploded, and it's a little bit tough to get around these days. But club's phenomenal. It's great.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm gonna send my son up there after he fires me. He's pretty close to me now.
Like I said, he's been playing so well. I've been trying to figure out who his coach has been. So
there he is. There's my boy. All right. Well, I appreciate your time, man. I think we could go for a couple more hours and dig a little deeper, but I know you've got a family and been on the lesson tee all day like myself. So one last question before we wrap. And if you've listened to the podcast, you probably know what's coming. But if you had to get a message to the world, to billions of people, and put it on a billboard, what would your billboard say and why?
Oh, man. What would my billboard say? Man, that's a good question. I didn't see that coming. Be adaptable. I think if there was, whether you're a student or a coach, right, I think you have to be adaptable. I think you have to maneuver through so many different avenues and go over and through so many different hoops, whether you're trying to learn the game or whether you're trying to learn coaching the game, right? I think if you're too dogmatic in what it is you believe in and what it is you're trying to do, you'll get stuck pretty quickly in this game. So I think, if you can just be able to adapt and, learn new trends and try to see where things are going and just be ahead of the curve, I think, again, whether you're a student or a coach, I think you're going to do pretty well.
I love it. That's a great answer. You're the best, man. I'm so proud of you. It's been really cool watching your career, and you're only getting started. You're still so young, and you've done so much. So I appreciate your time. And anything I haven't asked you that you want to discuss, or any closing remarks or ask from the audience before?
Yeah. And I appreciate you having me on here. And, I know we go way back, and I think everything you've done has been tremendous. And, I've seen you at the same time, right? Going from, just being kind of in this pack of golf coaches to ascending all these different ranks and getting to the top. So I think it's been pretty awesome to see. It's been pretty inspiring. I think a lot of people don't know this. I'm gonna tell this story real quick, but I entered one of my first interviews out of college was where you were teaching, right? Was this academy in Charlotte, Dana Rader's Academy, and ultimately I didn't get the job, which was one of the challenges of being this young coach. Was I was too underqualified to teach, but too overqualified to be an assistant. And a good friend of ours, Andrew Kiger, ended up getting a job, and Andrew and I went to college together, and he's an awesome coach. And he deserved the job. I mean, he got the job. That was the right call. But yeah, it's been awesome, just being around you, and I find what you've done to be inspiring too. So, kudos to you.
You're too kind, man. I appreciate that so much. So tell the listeners how they can reach out to you, give them your social handles, and so they can ask you some questions. You can argue with them.
Yeah, and I'll respond, right? So, and nobody's
will.
safe, right? So if you post something, it might get a comment of sarcasm.
That's right.
Right?
I love it. Yep.
Nobody's safe. So you can find me at Twitter and Instagram at tjyeaton.golf, or excuse me, TJ Yeaton Golf at TJ Yeaton Golf, and then Facebook just TJ Yeaton.
Awesome, man. I appreciate you.
You got it. Thanks.
We'll catch up soon. You got it.
Looking forward to it.
What's up, everyone? Guru back here again with a couple of things before you go. First, big thank you to TJ for coming on the show and spending some time. That was an awesome conversation. I hope you enjoyed it, and sharing his story and his incredible knowledge and insights on coaching. I thought he was very transparent, which was super cool, which I expected nonetheless from my boy. Again, you can follow him at TJ Yeaton Golf on Twitter and Instagram. And also, if you don't mind, give me a follow at Golf Guru TV. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter as well, and Jason Sutton Golf on Facebook. If you're a golfer or a coach, I will friend you up. Oh, and Golf Guru TV on TikTok. I'm actually doing some TikTok videos, just posting some swings, doing some cool stuff on there as well. Probably expand that here in the near future. If you have a question for the show, please send me an email at golfgurushow@gmail.com, or just hit me up on the DM on the gram or Twitter. That works just as well. Music was provided by Kevin MacLeod and Zach Mullet. And as I always leave you with, study, practice, teach, and then pass it on. Thanks so much for listening. I'll talk to you next time.